which we'll be doing tonight, and Posts from Suburbia, and the Pope Stories and Other Tales of Troubled Times, as well as poetry collections, Zen of Pop, New York, and Other Lovers, and Pugilistic.
Pugilistic.
That was a word I did not know until he handed me the book, and I'm like, I see some boxing gloves in front of it. I grew up here in Dansville, so it didn't help. He curates the Finger Lakes Art Series in Dansville, New York, and teaches writing and literature at New York City College of Technology. Ladies and gentlemen, George Guida.
Thank you, Bill. Also known as Mr. Dansville around here, native Dansvillian. Welcome to McFadden's. Welcome to the Finger Lakes Art Series. Nice to see a lot of people returning and some new people. I am going to read from this novel tonight. Before I do that, though, I just want to announce that this is a monthly thing for those of you, especially who haven't come out before. So we are usually third or fourth weekend of the month, third or fourth Friday. Next month is Tony Leuzzi, who is a Rochester poet, terrific Rochester poet. And then in May, we have William DeVault. Did you say DeVault or DeVoe? I don't know. Do you know him? No. Oh, sorry. From California. And in June, we have this guy named Michael Zarnacki, who's right here, great poet and publisher of poetry. So I encourage you all to stay tuned to our little Facebook site and see what's going on here. All right. And Bill, thank you. Yeah, I appreciate it. I do. Any introduction is good. Okay, this is my novel, The Uniform. This is my 10th book, my third book of fiction. And it's taken a long time to write. So, for the young writers in the audience, don't get discouraged. It might take you a long time while you do other things. So, let me give you a little background. The novel's basically, it's okay. I like to let the kids do their business first. It's okay. Are you gonna read, young lady? A little warning about what I'm going to read tonight. We do have children here. There's a little bit of foul language. I'll try to tone that down as much as I can. There's sort of one sort of charming scene and one not so charming scene that I'll read. The book follows the life of one man who becomes a cop. But that's not really most of the book. He's a cop for about 5 minutes, and he's a musician and a lot of other things in the course of about 50 years across the 20th century. So it's kind of got an epic sweep to it. I'm going to read a couple of pieces, one very early from 1950 when he is 16 years old. One thing to know in this first part is that he moves from upstate New York, Rome, New York, where a lot of my family's from, and where a certain gentleman over there, hi Carol, a certain gentleman over there is from. And he moves to New York in 1950 and falls in love with his first cousin, which causes all kinds of complications. So this is from that chapter. Up Rome, Alfie had only gone to one reception, and that was at the firehouse. This place, the Rex, looked bigger than Grand Central Station and had the same kind of ceiling with stars painted on it. The curved walls were lined with gold inlaid wood paneling. Against that background, Alfie was swimming in an ocean of dark suits, light dresses, and flowered hats. The waiters who circled the edges of the crowd wore tuxedos as fancy as the grooms. A small stage rose in front of the huge dance floor. To the side was a long table for the wedding party. If Adeline were a little older, she would be sitting up there with Anna Maria's sisters, and Alfie would be out of luck. Luck was on his side, though, because here she was, sitting at the next table just a few feet away. Adeline is his cousin, by the way. We are a family wedding. in case that wasn't obvious. His mother straightened Frankie's collar. You boys look very handsome, like movie stars. With his mouth full of hors d'oeuvres, Alfie's father winked at his sons, nodded his head, and smiled through tight lips. Alfie hoped he was making the old man proud. It was the least he could do. When the band started playing a quiet song with a lot of flute lines, Alfie's mother gave her boys instructions. When the time comes for dancing, don't be shy. Ask your cousins to show you how. Alfie had been trying to practice the Lindy, but something slower would take the pressure off. Oh, look, here's your cousin now. Look at those beautiful shoes, Adeline. Thank you, Aunt Penny. I got them for Miles. You're a lucky girl. Adeline stood with her head bowed. She didn't notice, or at least Alfie thought she didn't notice, him taking all of her in while his mother bent her ear. I was just telling the boys they shouldn't be shy about dancing. Sure, Adeline said, standing between Alfie's chair and his mother's. I just want to tell Alfie that if he wants to, he can dance with me. Isn't that nice? You hear that, Alfie? You have a partner. Alfie's heart pounded against his ribs. He tried not to face Adeline, whose chest was a magnet for his eyes. Thank you, Adeline. That's very sweet. Thank Adeline, son. He could feel the heat in his cheeks. Thank you. Sometimes he wished his mother spoke Italian instead of English. When Adeline went back to her seat, he turned on her. Come on, Mom. Come on, Mom, what? You should learn how to dance. She did this a lot, his mother, setting things up for him before he had a chance to do it himself. Sometimes she thought she knew everything, like some kind of witch. Not to say that she was setting him up with Adeline, she wouldn't do that, or would she? Maybe she didn't care, she was like that. Whatever the other women in the family did, she seemed to do the opposite. She danced with anybody who asked her, she played music better than the men in the family, and she even went to church only when she felt like it. A mind of her own, his father liked to say. So, if Alfie had to dance with Adeline, he'd do it. He was bracing himself, but the first song after dessert stumped him. Betty Goodman, Maddie, let's get up. And there they went, all the grown-ups like dogs who heard a whistle. Frankie fidgeted in his seat, primed to complain. You want my cake? I don't like the middle. There's rum in it, that's why. Maybe you'll like it when you're older. Frankie is his little brother. I don't think so. Why couldn't they have something good like Sliadels? Alfie smiled as he conjured the flaky pastry. That would be good. Tell you what, you leave me alone the rest of the night. Tomorrow, I'll go down to Savary's and get you a couple. What do you say? Sounds all right to me. Good, it's a deal. Adeline's sweet voice. What's a deal? Alfie liked that she said what she thought. He could talk to a girl like that. Nothing, just my kid brother. Oh, maybe he can go sit next to cousin Sammy. I think he brought some baseball cards. Said he had a lot of the Dodgers. Frankie perked up. Which ones? Campanella? Farillo? Where is he? Adeline pointed across the immense ballroom. Better go now before the other boys get the good ones. She watched Frankie dodge waiters and skirt tables until he reached the promised land. Alfie watched her watching, how she craned her neck and giggled. Some kind of miracle. He loves playing ball, she said, still watching Frankie. Anytime we come to visit Grandma, I see him out there. Alfie suddenly felt easy as a breeze. Are you going to show me how to dance? She studied him. If you want. But I just said that so I wouldn't have to dance with the older boys. Whenever there's a wedding or a party, they throw me around like a rag doll. If you don't do something about it, being a girl can be that way. Alfie loosened his tie so the collar stopped pinching his neck. What do you want to do then? Well, why don't we just talk? We're cousins and I hardly know you. Alfie looked into her black eyes. They glowed like the darkness around a campfire, the kind that made you comfortable and scared at the same time. Like you could walk off into the woods and disappear, or an animal could leap out and tear you to shreds. We should be close friends. No girl ever wanted to be his friend before. Why did Adeline have to be the first? He dropped his eyes. Still, it was true that he didn't have so many friends in Brooklyn. For one thing, he liked to practice and didn't go out as much as the other kids. For another, they told him he talked funny, like someone was holding his mouth open. There was Sebi Payon, who he knew from school, but who worked with his father most of the time. There was Snooky, his best pal here, except lately he gotten himself a girl, some bitch from Bath Beach who never left him alone. So you want to talk? Adeline nodded. I think there's a hallway outside those doors over there, probably quiet. Their whole family and the Polacks family filled the dance floor. The young kids, excuse me for the language, there's going to be some offensive terms here because this is 1950 and these characters are who they are. The Polacks family filled the dance floor. The young kids played games by the far wall. She led him away, slipping past her. Alfie held open one of the double doors leading out to the hallway and took a deep whiff of her perfume as she walked through. If she just wanted to be his friend, she didn't have to smell so good and smile so much. There's a bench by the telephone booth. Adeline sat him down and sat as close as she could, facing but not touching him. Through the wall, Alfie could hear the band crucifying Duke Ellington. That's better, she said. Now, ask me a question, any question you want. In his head, Alfie ran through the kinds of questions you could ask a person you didn't really know. If he asked her what her favorite anything was, he'd sound like a dope. What else? He already knew where she lived and what she was. Oh, here was a good one. Why don't I ever see you in school? Adeline's face lit up, then hardened into a serious expression so that Alfie noticed the worry lines in her forehead. They made her look older, like someone had written secrets on her skin. That's a very good question, she said, giving him a quick pat on the hand. The reason is simple. It's my father. He's from Italy. I noticed. She play-swatted his hand. I mean, he has strange ideas about girls. All he wants me to do is study, 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 but he thinks girls only have a certain place. Did Alfie disagree? Like what? Like being secretaries. Is there something wrong with being a secretary? Adeline stared at him for a few seconds, which made Alfie feel something he didn't often feel and didn't like to feel. Stupid. No, there's nothing wrong with it, I suppose. It's just not what I want to do. How could he get her to smile again? So don't do it. I don't want to, but he sent me a girls' commercial because that's what girls learn there, and that's why you never see me at school. Alfie was disappearing into her. He could feel her breath on his cheek. She was so close he could count her eyelashes. He asked low, almost whispering, without caring about the answer, "Can't you talk to your father? Did you ever try to talk to my father?" Those dark eyes. What do you really want to do? I don't know, maybe something where I could travel around. I know I don't want to be a commercial, or even here in Brooklyn, I mean. And I know you know what it's like to be someplace else. Do you like it upstate? Question surprised him. Wait, think, say something smart. It was okay, I liked how quiet it was. No response. Was she expecting more? You could just walk around town and nobody worried about you. Smirk meant what? Do you ever want to leave Brooklyn, she asked. Through the wall now, Alfie could hear music. They were playing some Italian song he didn't know, and every once in a while the crowd yelled, "Hey!" If he married Adeline, they picked better music for the reception. I just got here. She frowned. He should clear things up. I guess I'd leave when the time was right, like the time was right for us to come here. What do you mean? If he told her his wedding plans, she'd think he was a nut. But then, up Rome, I had some things happen. Adeline rested her hand on top of his as he spoke. I don't really know if I could tell anybody. Do you mind if I don't talk about it? He tried his best to look sad, which worked. After checking to make sure they were still alone, she leaned in and gave Alfie a hug that made him feel like he was floating. He felt her hands lightly massaging his back. He was foxtrotting with her across the waves, doing the tango as they drifted around the world. When he started moving his hands over her shoulder, she pulled away but kept hold of his fingers. It's all right. We'll be friends for a long time. The words, "I know," came from his mouth before he could stop them. So what do you want to do? Alfie showed her the palms of his hands. Play guitar. He looked at his fingers as though each one could explain. All kinds of music, bluegrass, country, blues, race music, even some jazz. Back in Rome, my folks didn't care much about school, but here all of a sudden it's a big deal. And when I'm in school, all I think about is playing. He exhaled. and some other things. He squeezed her hand and her eyes glowed. When I get a D on my report card, Pop tells Mom it's for dandy. But she's afraid I'm gonna flunk out of 10th grade, and then what? Then you play the guitar. He wanted to hug her again, but instead tried to do what he really wanted to do. He held her shoulders and pulled her closer. This time, she pulled away. What's the matter? Adeline's pout, but her eyes fire out. I'm not one of those girls from the Amboy Dukes, Alfie. And besides, you know why not. What would people say? He wanted to tell her about the presidents and their cousins, but instead a wave of shame broke over him, a cold shower, except that he was sweating. She stroked his arm. I like you, and we'll both leave, you'll see, but we'll still be close like this. Like this. She squeezed his hand one more time. Wait. Her dress whispered as she walked back toward the hall, making a final swoosh as she struggled with the door. When she finally got it open far enough, she looked back at him and screwed up her face, then disappeared. The music was still going. It was Angelina, the Louis Prima number. Alfie sat listening to the rest of it. He got up from the bench and pulled open the door. Back inside, the band started something slow and probably older than him. He spotted his mother and father among the few couples left on the dance floor. He tried to imagine them keeping company, what they had in common. His father's hair was almost gray, slicked back so that he looked natural in a suit, even though you knew he'd rather be in shirt sleeves. His arms were around his mother's waist, while hers were over his shoulders. They swayed back and forth in front of the bandstand. His mother looked bored, but his father smiled like she was singing him a love song. And I'll read one more bit. This is totally different. This is at a family reunion near Rome, New York, set in 1969. So now the character's 35 years old. He's just quit the police force after a traumatic incident during a riot. And he's going back to this reunion for the first time since his father has died. Between the American flags planted all over the property and the ones flying from antennas on his cousin's parked truck, Alfie felt like he was driving into a national cemetery. He heard shouting, but couldn't make out the words, the usual loudmouths. He parked and closed the car doors quietly as he could. Since the Columbia fiasco, where he first had the sick feeling of hunting another human being, he couldn't stomach too much commotion or too much attention. When he got near the house, he saw the younger guys huddled around folding tables, playing cards, swearing. Meanwhile, the old uncles and cousins were yelling their heads off in front of the house, playing Mora. Closer in, Alfie heard Uncle Patsy and Cousin Al, both at least in their 60s now, both wearing windbreakers and fishing hats, both throwing whatever number of fingers they thought would get them to the totals in their head. Patsy's voice sounded like a blender on high. Cinque! No luck. Al's baritone. Quattro! Nothing. This is a game, by the way, that really exists, as I'm sure Mark is aware over there. Yeah, where you try to guess the total number of fingers thrown out by the two players, and they yell it out in Italian.
Rock, paper, scissors.
Patsy again. Say! The old fool danced around like a kid, holding out an open palm for Al to fill with greenbacks. Alfie smiled in spite of himself. Years ago, his father had gone back and forth like this with Patsy for an hour. The two men would be so hoarse afterward that they could barely talk. Last year, Alfie was starting to walk again, and his father was already gone. When he called to say he couldn't make it, all he heard back was, "Sorry about your old man." He knew his story had gotten around to them, but not a single cousin asked about Alfie's health or what he was doing now. If he guessed right, they were ashamed of him. One year, he dusted 23 of 25 clay birds. Only his father had ever done better. And what did it matter now? Some college asshole could break him, drive him off the force. He was letting them all down. Way back in the old days, his cousins had held a reunion at the Red Rooster Hotel in Catskill. That was before Bobby Marchese got caught shooting a pheasant on the front lawn of the church across the street, and the police kindly asked them to move their party somewhere else. The next year, Zed Zamboni volunteered his place. Zed was a distant cousin by marriage. He made a fortune laying marble floors for people who could afford them. With his pile of money, he bought 150 acres of hill country, built a big ranch house complete with a gigantic stone patio and wraparound porch, and made the rest of the land his personal shooting range and game preserve. The place used to make Alfie feel proud and safe, at least a few days a year. Time and everybody but these few men could go to hell. But ever since he joined the force, coming here, when he had the will to come at all, hadn't been the same. Still, a promise was a promise, so no matter how hard it would be to relax with cousins who couldn't look you in the eye, he didn't want to talk about the old man. And he didn't want to hear the word sorry. His mind was running 100 different places where nobody wanted to be. Playing cards was a no-go. Maybe he'd shoot, but with his head not right, what would he hit? And the doctors who were keeping track of him still had an okay drinking. Problem, since most of her cousins were what you might call casual alcoholics. He greeted the uncles first. They patted him on the shoulder, took his face in their hand, and kissed him on both cheeks. Sure, they hadn't asked him what had happened to him, but in their case, it was because life had already gotten the best of them. They expected it to happen to you. One by one, they hugged him, looking like they wanted to cry. Instead, they told him how much they missed his father, one of their gray gang. He was too young, too young. Next, Alfie went over to the card tables. Most of the younger cousins there raised their heads and nodded. Angelo, the cousin he featured least, got up from his folding chair. Angelo was maybe 40 now. He'd been a sniper in the Korean War. And like he told everybody he met, with the right bullet in an M1, he could shoot a guy's eye out at 300 yards. Combat for him was sitting on top of a hill or a building, picking off dots on the ground, soldiers, civilians, maybe kids. Did he know what it was like to feel a bone snap when you hit it with a baton, to see a woman shivering naked in a corner, bruises all over her face, to hold a child's broken body as he took his last breath and his hands went cold? Angelo was a state trooper, the arrogant kind who gave troopers a bad name even among other cops. He bragged a lot about telling fellow troopers who took bribes that they were disgracing their uniform. He bragged so much about it that Alfie knew he must be taking bribes himself. Alfie felt sorry for the poor jabooks who were shit unlucky enough to have Angelo stop them. A goddamn hero. What happened? Did you run into these effing hippies up here? Oh wait, that was last week. Yeah, effing love and peace. Angelo's breath smelled of beer, anchovy pizza, and mildew. And your father? I'm sorry. Yeah. And your mother, at least she's around. For the first time since the riot, Alfie wanted to hit somebody. Instead, he place slapped Angelo's cheek and walked past the tables again. This time, the cousins ignored him. They were playing draw, throwing back paper cups of beer and red wine, taunting each other like they were enemies. You can't play us straight that way, jerk off. Look at this fucking guy. Does your mother know you play like this? Alfie sat on a folding chair away from the crowd for what felt like an hour, waving off a couple of half-hearted offers to join the game, remembering the first time his father took him and his brother here. Right away, you could see Frankie didn't belong. He was in cooking school then, living in an apartment in the city. Most of that weekend, he sat in a corner near the cooler watching everybody else play cards, play horseshoes, shoot skis, shoot the shit. He remembered the old man not liking the way Frankie had acted, but not saying anything about it, and hardly saying anything at all on the long ride home. Alfie hadn't been too thrilled with his brother either. And what would the cousins think now? Did they know his brother was a queer? Whatever way it was, Frankie had never come back. On the other hand, for a few years, Alfie loved it. When one reunion ended, he couldn't wait for the next one. His mother could take the family or leave them, but to his father, this reunion and his family generally was everything. Coming here was a 3-day Sunday dinner without a woman to nag him and with a chance to shoot till his shoulder was sore. Alfie liked it because you could say whatever you wanted about anybody else outside the family. Who cared about them? And if you could take a little ball busting, you were in the club for life. Even with his bad wrist, Alfie could still play some simple songs with the old man. He was nothing close to what he'd been, but the two of them could lead the cousins through the standard numbers, mostly from the 20s and 30s. The repertoire included Jimmy Brown, the Newsboy, Dinah, If You Knew Susie, and some real oldies like 15 Miles on the Erie Canal and Bill Bailey, Won't You Please Come Home. Songs with choruses you could follow when you were half in the bag. And it didn't matter that Bill Bailey was supposed to be sung by a woman. If there were 40 guys there, 30 of them were belting it out at the top of their lungs. During those years, Alfie had played cards and been able to talk with his cousins. So long as they talked about things, old family stories, women, food, houses, vacations, kids, only as ways to make smart aleck remarks or to trigger their rituals. You could always count on what sounded like an argument between two cousins ending this way. Cousin number one, you know what? Cousin number two, what? Cousin number one, you're a great man. Cousin number two, waiting for it. Oh yeah? Cousin number one, yeah, turning to the gallery. Hey fellas, this is a great guy right here. He's like a god. Doesn't he deserve a hymn? Give him a hymn. Let's hear it. Cousins in unison. Hymn, hymn, fuck him. Once Alfie became a cop, a game like that seemed stupid, like his cousins were a posse of bored delinquents standing on the corner of the avenue waiting for something to happen so they could stand up to somebody threatening the neighborhood or talk about how they would. Sitting apart, Alfie listened closely to what they were saying, especially to the stories. Angela was going on again about hippies. It was like an invasion, right, Zed? What'd they call it? Zed was chewing on a cigar and strangling a beer bottle, one eye on the poker game. He kept the cigar in his mouth while he spat out an answer. Woodstock. They were fucking everywhere. Jim Bruce was coming up the weekend. It took him 6 hours to get her. Jim Bruce, tell him. Jim Bruce was a man mountain whose mother was one of the goddesses watching over Rome, New York. His father had opened the Circle Bar during the war. Alfie remembered when his old man worked there. It was Jim Bruce and Eddie Schiavone who started putting this thing together. As soon as all the younger fellows started to leave Rome and get jobs and get married, they needed a reunion, men only. It let you pretend you were living what you could never happen again, and maybe never happened at all. Jim Bruce walked over to Zed like a drunken bear and pawed his cousin's shoulder. Alfie thought about what might have gone on at Woodstock, about what had happened at Columbia. Since that day, he hadn't been able to listen to music too often. Maybe he should start listening again. He heard on the news that the Beatles had another record coming out, but here was Jim Bruce. I was stuck on traffic on 17th, surrounded by all these kids, half of them with no clothes on, radios blasting, effing mess. But at least it was raining on and off and it wasn't hot. I hate the heat. People say they want to move to Florida. F that. Bunch of effing rebels. Everybody down there's half a moolie. He took another long swig of beer. While the rest of the cousins were laughing at the joke, Jim Bruce looked over at Alfie, as if to say, go F yourself. Bet you got a lot of them in New York, eh, cuz? Alfie hadn't heard the word moolie since he was on the job. Moulignon, eggplant. It struck him funny. Eggplants were purple, and all the cousins liked eggplant. Did any of them know why they said it? The muscles in Alfie's arms twitched, and he sat up a little straighter in his chair, looking at John Brutes now the way he looked at the protesters. Normally, if a guy looked at John Brutes like that, it was a fight. But at that particular moment, the big fuck didn't care. He was on a roll. Anyway, I'm sitting there, so I light up a cigar. And don't you think this effing asshole kid with no shirt on comes up to the car and asks me for a light? I think these kids ought to get effing jobs. But what do I care about a light? So I pull out the lighter, and what does he do? He pulls out a joint. And I give him a look, and I put the lighter away. Now, mind you, this bullshit festival is on the radar all summer. Every cop and his mother's out. So then this kid starts getting fresh, saying, hey, come on, man, I need a light. And he's yelling in my face. Then you're not going to effing believe this. He pounds on the door and starts sticking his arms inside the effing car. Oh, shit. Yeah. He's reaching in, so I grab him by the effing scraggly beard with one hand and pull his face down to the steering wheel. Then with the other hand, I grab my 45 from the glove compartment and stick it right in his effing face. And he's shaking, ready to shit himself. And I say, look at me, dickhead. And I look him right in the eye and I say, walk back over to your effing car right now and don't say an effing word or I'll blast your goddamn brains all over the road. Half the cousins were still playing cards, barely paying attention, but the other half, the non-degenerate gamblers, were all nodding and laughing. They congratulating Jim Bruce on his stand and his story as the giant stalked over to the cooler, shaking hands along the way, a celebrity. And I'll skip right to, there are more stories. And then there's a story about Alfie. See if I can find it. Okay. Here we go. It was Louis, limping toward him, his hair wild like a circus clown. All eyes turned to Alfie, half frowning faces, like he was about to testify in a courtroom. Alfie, you remember that time in Rosendale? You was what, maybe 26, 27? A few heads nodded, remembering a better version of their cousin, one Louis was trying to revive. We're out there in some bullshit bar, and there's 10 people in the whole place. The jukebox was playing a tune Alfie liked. Some kid, I don't know, he was a little younger than you, was buzzing around all night like a fly. He's looking over our shoulders, right on top of us. One of the cousins interrupted with a signal. How close was he? Louis spun around to face the cousin holding his two index fingers an inch apart. This close. I'm telling you, he was on top of us with a dopey grin, and he's saying perverted things to us. I didn't even understand some of them. No kidding, another cousin called out. Louis pantomimed a pulled punch. Hey, one of you needs a shot. Come on, no, Zed, you were there, no? Come on, this kid with the goofy face, he wouldn't let up. So somebody, Charlie, was it you? Somebody says, hey, Alfie, please take care of this kid. Alfie remembered the exact moment, the exact beer he was drinking, the exact redhead whose eye he was trying to catch. And yeah, the kid's goofy face. He still didn't like the face, but he hated himself now for thinking that way. So Alfie, you remember what you did? F you, Louis. And excuse me, Lord, but F all of them. For all the things they had no idea about, forgive them, and also F them. They made Alfie want to be as old as he felt. Ask, who's that kid in love? Who's the punk who thinks he can play guitar? Who's that soldier? Who's that uniform? It's not me, Lord. Look what I am. Look how I'm nothing. You told the kid to come inside and you kept shoving him toward the door. And you remember what he did, Alfie, fellas? You remember? Effing kid, the cousin yelled so Louis could go on. Effing kid keeps coming like he's a wind-up toy or something, and you could see Alfie's face getting red. And they all looked to see if his face was red now. And if they could make him be that version of himself again, that pet animal. So F them, and F them, and F them. And if I say that, my father, do you forgive me? And now, do you know everything? Do you know what really happened to the preacher? Do you understand the way your son could be? Finally, it's like Alfie can't take it anymore. They were all smiling like a stripper had just walked on stage in front of them. His body one reflex, Alfie stood up and started talking, bullets in his voice. So you want to hear how it ends, boys, right? They all stopped smiling. So I grabbed this goofy kid by his collar. He looked at Angela like he looked at the kid at Columbia whose arm he'd wrecked, like someone who deserved the pain. He heard his voice getting louder and louder. You know what I did, Angela? You want to know, don't you? Quiet. I hit the kid all I had, right in his effing ribs. Want me to show you? Angela looked like he would piss himself. And what did the kid do, Louis? You remember? Louis almost whispered, sure. He went down like a ton of bricks. Remember, he was thrashing around on the floor, and how everybody in there was ready to jump on me, telling me the kid wasn't right in the head, and how they sent for the kid's mother, and how the ambulance came. He turned to Zed. Remember that, cousin? And remember what you did when all that happened? Zed screwed up his face, shrugged and conceded. Tell me, cuz. You didn't know whether to shit, pick your nose, or eat cherries. Zed waved him off and went for another beer. He was half a retard, boys, but I showed him who he shouldn't F with. Alfie sat down again and closed his eyes. His cousin's voices were grunts like you heard when a fist connected with a rib or a cheekbone. Maybe he'd always been that animal. All the faces he'd ever hit appeared to him now, suspects in a lineup with him, the criminal. His head was starting to throb. If he'd been drinking, he'd have to throw up. He kept his eyes closed for a long time. When he finally opened them again, he saw right in front of him the big belly of Charlie Baliato, his father's first cousin. It's another state trooper. He was talking to Alfie, trying to make nice, saying something about the moon landing. But what Charlie really wanted was to swap cop stories. Thank you. Very much. Now for the fun part of the evening. I think Bill, we usually do a Q&A here, for those of you who don't know. So like usually I'm Q&Aing the author and trying to get everybody involved to ask questions. So we could start with questions or we could, oh yes, sir. What's your name?
Noah.
Noah, I know.
Do you go here often for events?
I have a secret, no. I own the place. Don't tell anybody. What do you wanna buy it? Think about it.
How much?
Oh, I don't know, ask my wife.
How much is it?
Not yet, when you get a little older, we'll talk, we'll definitely talk. You like it?
Yeah,
Cool.
I really like this place.
I was talking to your sister, and I know you guys are, what's adorable?
The bunnies.
Oh, okay, that'll make my wife very happy. Yeah.
Bunnies are the best part.
All right, well, I know you guys are from Cohocton, which is the first place I ever lived when I came up here, so, yeah, I had a soft spot. Yeah, questions, Melissa? Melissa,
Wondering why it took 10 years
10 years,
to write this book.
it took 25.
Oh, 25.
Oh, wow.
You have 10 books and 20.
This was going on in the background pretty much the whole time I was writing the 9 other books. Because as I've learned, writing a mature novel is not something you can do without maturity. Good, yes, young lady. Because bad things have happened to him in his life, and if you read the book, you'll know what those are. But he's angry. He's pretty angry. Yeah. Noah, I'm gonna go back. You have another question?
How many books have you
10. I've written more, but 10 published. Yeah. Sounds like a lot, but it feels like not a lot when I was your age, that's what I wanted to do. I wanted to write books.
I'm writing a story.
Are you? Are you gonna give us a little of it tonight?
Probably not gonna publish it. I don't have it.
Oh, okay. How about next time?
I'm not sure if it'll be finished.
Okay. You sound like a writer, for sure. Definitely. Michael and Linda.
I was just wondering, I've read your poetry before, and was wondering, if you could say a little bit about the difference between both the mindset and the discipline it takes to do like a book of poems and a novel like.
So one of the reasons I never wrote this book before I finished the book until the first draft I finished, I think in 2016. One of the reasons it took that long is because I was in graduate school, so I was studying, and I could write poetry, I could write poems, because that was pretty quick and dirty from my point of view, even if I revised them, and back in those days I didn't do a lot of revision, now I do. It was just more manageable. One of my mentors told me a long time ago, like, when you write a novel, it's a campaign, and he was not wrong. It really is a campaign. It's a much more involved thing. And I have another novel called this novel here, which I finished when I think I was 27 years old. And it's in vignettes. And again, same reason. Vignettes are vignettes. Continuous narrative is continuous narrative. So I always wanted to be a novelist when I was a kid. So that was really my goal. But to answer your question, I think writing a novel for me is more like being an actor. It's more like assuming a consciousness and living in it for a while and thinking about the characters constantly for a long time. Poetry, you do that, but on a smaller scale. I don't know if that's your experience or.
Yeah, I haven't written it. The idea of writing a novel just like blows me away. I've written some short stories, and I know that even in that shorter span of there, the short stories are closer than a novel is. It is a different. You have to get your head in a different place. So I'm wondering about it because as you were reading the characters, it sounds like you hear them very clearly in your head because you're sort of doing the voices.
So characters, in this case, my dad was a cop, among other things. He was also a construction foreman, a craftsman, very gentle guy. And many people here have met him and probably vouch for that. Like, he's just a gentle guy. He's not this guy. This guy is more like his brother, who's also a cop. 3 brothers all became cops in New York City. So I had a lot of cops, a lot of law enforcement in my family from upstate. My family is from Rome, New York, that side of it. I was talking to someone at the University of Miami today about this, like, it's an Italian-American thing, there's kind of this schizoid relationship with law and order. On the one hand, they're kind of proud of the gangster image, a lot of Italian-Americans kind of are, even though they deny it, they're still like, cling to it in certain ways. But then there's also a part of it, there's a part that there's a segment of Italian American society that craves law and order. Maybe it's the history, maybe it's the image. So there is this kind of schizoid relationship that I've always observed, and my friend was telling me he's always observed today. Yeah, so that's part of why I wanted to write this. Yeah.
George, a comment and then a question.
Yeah.
And sort of similar to your question, but comment, University of Buffalo, way back in the '70s, they didn't go to this reading some novel, and I don't write fiction, right? I poetry. And some novelist was giving a talk, lecture, whatever. And my friends went, one of them came back, told me afterwards, yeah, he said, when he doesn't feel like writing, he writes poetry.
I know.
I've lost
So,
that name out.
I have a worse thing to say about poetry. I have an even worse thing to say about poetry. For a long time, I had the urge, like I couldn't stop myself from writing poetry, but I hated reading it for years. And I still don't read a ton of poetry. I read it very selectively, and I get bored quickly. And I don't know, I think I'm more attracted to fiction, and everybody's different, but poetry's wonderful. When it's wonderful, it's wonderful. It's nothing like it.
So my question I wanted to ask, so you're reading fiction in this novel. To you, what's the difference between reading fiction like you just did now, at least, as opposed to giving a poetry reading?
Poetry readings are easier. Way easier, because you're in the character, in the moment, or in the experience for 2 minutes. The fiction readings are harder to follow for the audience. They require more acting at the mic. This is my opinion. I have trouble following fiction readings from more than that was to me, that's a really long fiction reading that I just gave, because I read 2 pieces. That was the only feature. So that's good, I'm glad, but I think it's harder. I don't know how other people feel. I think poetry's easier to deal with. It's usually small, unless you've got like a 6-page poem, which happens. Yeah, Ava, you had a question too.
Yeah, I had a few questions. So first I'll ask one about poetry. You said that you're very selective about reading poetry.
Mm-hmm.
Do you have a particular, I guess, genre of poetry you like?
Lyric poetry. Poetry that's about the relationship between the speaker and the experience the speaker's having. I shouldn't say I don't read a lot of poetry, because I do now, and I read a lot of poetry by friends of mine, some of whom are in the room, who write really good poetry. So that's one of the beauties of being a poet, is like a friend of mine said, you say famous poet, and I don't know what you mean. Poetry is not a genre you write in to become famous. And if you're a good poet, you meet a lot of people all over the country who are also good poets, and you get them. Michael will tell you this. You meet everybody, and it's great. Like you can know the best poets in the world, and you learn from them. So yeah, I don't know if that answers your question. But another question.
Oh, did you have, I mean, I'm trying to think of words.
I'm sorry. I love that you're carefully phrasing the question as I fumble with the mic. Yeah.
I just want to make sure that I don't ask the wrong thing.
It's okay.
So, did you have, well, of course you had, how much research do you have to do for your book, and how did you handle it?
That's a great question. A lot. Firsthand, secondhand. I interviewed people, but mostly I was able to go from memory, because so much of this is based on family lore in this case. But filling in like the texture is really important if you're writing historical fiction. You don't want to overdo it, but you don't want to underdo it. So it's, how do you pick the details that are important? And I know there are times I probably overdid it, underdid it, but the details that resonate with being in 1950 or 1969 or 2003 that means something to the characters, and you're not just throwing it out there just to have it. It's important to the character too, and it tells us something about life at that time. That kind of research has become way easier because of the glorious internet. I come from an age before the internet. And those in the room who come from an age before the internet will tell you just how different life was.
Oh, my God.
It is unimaginable what it was like to do research in a library. You'd go to a library, you'd look for a book or a magazine article, you'd have to go through microfilm, index cards. And then you'd find like 5 other things that were sort of related, but were really interesting. So like, oh no, let me read this instead. And it was a lot of accidents happened that way, which were nice accidents, but it wasn't as precise and quick. So you guys, growing up the last couple of generations, really, you can research so quickly. And as long as you're good at winnowing the information and telling what's true and what's not, critical thinking is really important. I think the internet could possibly destroy our society. I think it's in the process of doing it now because people they're not taught to think critically enough anymore. And they can't separate truth from fiction.
No.
I can editorialize now and give you guys examples of what I think is absolute BS that gets taken for truth. And there's no scientific basis whatsoever. That's a problem. But for research, for writing fiction, it's fabulous.
Perfection.
Yeah.
But trying to write a paper now without taking the index cards with chapter facts,
Mhm.
you get information, and it's so easy to copy and paste that you don't even realize it because you're trying to change the words, but it's still not different.
Yeah.
Like I hadn't done one
Yeah.
since 1970.
Well,
76, and I had to do one like
It's-
5 years ago, and it was so hard for me.
It's easy to plagiarize.
Yeah,
It's way easier to plagiarize now because of chatbots. So I've started to get, and all my colleagues have started to get, not only research papers that are obviously generated by AI, but poems that are generated by AI, which thank God are still so terrible that you can tell. But I think within a few years, they're not going to be. And I don't know what happens next after that. I mean, people write for fun, and maybe it's people keep their writing off the internet, and that's the way to sort of stop the chatbots. I don't know. That's an amazing problem to have, really, to live with if you think about it for a writer.
when I think of poetry, I think of emotions and sights or feelings. Feelings as opposed to emotions, but it's like facts and a history that you try to put in
Mhm.
to music almost.
Mhm.
And prose is a lot of facts with a lot of memory, but it's also some
And-
music, but it's just
And
history.
it can be.
Yeah,
I set out to write a story, like a sort of traditionally framed narrative that had a narrative line that people could follow and characters. So in a sense, this is a very traditional novel. It's not
Yeah.
experimental at all, really. But you could write a novel, you could be Celine, you could write a novel that's extremely experimental. It just
Okay.
jumps from thought to thought, you're William Burroughs. You could do,
I'm a prose, just straight prose.
Yeah, and that is, most fiction is like that, but certainly not all, right? So
Yeah.
there's crossover, and there's poetry that's highly narrative.
But I did enjoy that.
Oh, thanks, appreciate that. Yeah, I should say, the other thing that was fun, just from a cultural point of view, is, those of us of a certain age, the culture has changed so much in 50 years. Like, I knew a lot of guys like that, people who were that outwardly tough, just like, and it was normal. That was a normal thing for people to be that outwardly tough all the time. That is not normal anymore.
Right.
The culture has become much more mediated, for good and sometimes for ill, but often for good. I think there's less violence. If I think about what life was like in 1980, maybe, it's much more violent in a lot of ways. So it's interesting, Marty.
With your character development, you go from a fairly naive individual to a person who's quite hard. Is did you make a plan for that?
Yep.
Were you?
Yeah, I was gonna age the character across 50 years and his voice was gonna change.
Yeah.
Oh, definitely, yeah, because his perception of everything changes.
Is there a certain point when you decided that this is what happens and this is how he's gonna be now?
No, it evolved over a long period of time. I mean, I had the first scene in the book, the first chapter was in 1968. That's the first thing that was in my head. It's the only chapter that's really out of chronological order. So I wrote that first and then I went back and I had to figure out his history. I mean, I have a huge outline of character sketches, books of things for these guys. Yeah, I don't always do that, but I guess I had to. Also, keeping it straight, for a novelist, if you're gonna write novels, Ava, just the logistics of keeping it all in your head, like not making consistency errors, continuity errors. I was reading this last week when it was printed, and I went, oh my God, it's a continuity error, and I freaked out. I was about to call the publisher and say, please, if there's another printing, like, please. But then I realized, oh, no, that's okay. Because I had forgotten, and it's easy to do. You just, that's what, when I say it's a campaign, it is more of a campaign that way. It's more to keep straight.
Yeah, I'm not all the way through yet, but I love that you're sort of learning along the way how his character developed, you know, the circumstances, the incidents that drove his character to where.
Yeah, and that's always part of the fun with fiction is the exposition, learning how people get to where they are. Yeah, exposition in action. I'm sorry, I teach creative writing.
No, it's good. It's good.
Yeah.
So you've written 10 books. What were the genres?
I have 3 books of fiction, including a book of short stories, which is behind me. 2 books of criticism, but I've written a lot of criticism because I became a professor and you have to do that, which is why all this other stuff took so long, is because I had to write like article upon article, things that were interesting, but weren't really what I wanted to do. And then I have 5 volumes of poetry. And I just finished a memoir. And the next book is a novel. And simultaneously, there's a book of poems going on that I've been trying to finish for a while. So it's just fun to write. And I wrote a play, 2 plays actually. Yeah. Once you start writing, we were talking about this earlier, Darlene and I, kind of doesn't, the genre sort of doesn't matter. You sort of, you're willing to try anything once you really get into it. This will be fun. I'm bored. Let me try this.
What's the next novel?
The next novel is a sequel to the Brothers Karamazov set in Dansville, New York. Not kidding. I wish I were kidding. So Mitya Karamazov and Alyosha Karamazov wind up in Dansville working at the home on the hill. And that's actually, and if you read the Brothers Karamazov, that's in the novel that Mitya, who's accused of killing his father, is going to go to America as one of the ways to possibly escape. So it's a lot of research because I have to do the Russian part, and then I have to do the American part in 1876, and I have to learn more about Dansville, and I have to get all these documents from the Historical Society and other places. It's taken forever.
So is it a crime novel or is it more?
Yeah, kind of.
Yeah.
In a minor key, not like that. For those of you who don't, if you haven't read the Brothers Karamazov, I don't know who hasn't. It's a novel about 3 brothers who have a father who's just absolutely despicable. He's a horrible human being, and eventually someone kills him. And one of the brothers is put on trial for that. Yeah. So it's my favorite novel. Which says something about me. I love my yeah.
How old are you?
Oh, book? 39? Took me a long time. No, 35. I book of essays, 35.
I thought I should mention that story I'm creating is a collaboration between me and one of my friends. It's sort of like a Dungeons and Dragons thing.
Oh, people still play Dungeons and Dragons. That makes me so happy.
I do every
Yeah.
Tuesday with my
Oh
grandchildren.
my God.
With my grandchildren. 6 of them,
I,
every Tuesday.
That's fantastic. Well, I wish can I say, I want to say real quick, I wish you guys would like come to my college and be students. That would be great. I teach at New York City College of Technology, so probably these guys are going to like Harvard, Yale, or wherever else they're gonna go. But my modest little college in Brooklyn, yeah. Noah, you were gonna finish.
My mom, got me into Dungeons and Dragons, A for 2. I'm in the Dungeons and Dragons Club at my school, so she,
Wow.
yeah, the story I'm creating, like, takes place and it's like 3 things at once. It's a story, Dungeons and Dragons, and The Legend of Zelda. I included characters from The Legend of Zelda. It takes place in Hyrule.
They call that blending your influences.
Yes, I do that a lot.
Can I, do they still play Dungeons and Dragons with the cool dice?
Yeah, I
And all
love
that?
D20s.
Oh, wow. Oh, man, there's hope for humanity.
D20s are like the best dice ever, but they're also the loudest dice ever.
We'll talk. I'm gonna wrap this up maybe with a question from Bill, who I asked. I was like, Bill, would you be the questioner tonight?
He was afraid no one was gonna ask questions.
And
It wasn't a surprise.
he told me to watch out. So you have a killer question?
Well,
Embarrassing?
I got 2. One, while I was reading the book, I was struggling with the Italian slang.
Yeah, there's a little of it, yeah.
There's a little more than a little.
Dialect words, yeah.
And it's all in Italian, and I got sick of looking up.
You can't really look, you could look those words up. I don't know how successful you'd be.
Some are. So, do you feel as though for a non-Italian speaking audience that a little something is lost by it?
That's a good question. So,
And before you answer, I had asked George if it would help if he had a little dictionary in the back that kind of outlined what those words meant.
so I've been thinking about this for a long time. In fact, this is my first book of poems. This is, I think, notable, and I think why people noticed it when I published it is because it used all these Italian dialects and other words that honestly were just like in the air when I was a kid. I didn't understand what they meant. I had no idea. I'm sure you're shaking your head like, I didn't know what a chidru was. I didn't know what like it was to be scacciato. Do you guys know what that means? Probably not, right? It means like worn out, like it's all scacciato. But I had no idea where the words came from. And so I was writing about that. I've been writing about that for like 30 years, trying to figure that out. But I think you get the sense, I'm hoping you get the sense from the narrative. Maybe I'm kidding myself. All the other part of that answer is, I did, in grad school, I studied what they used to call multicultural literature. And so I was always encountering words and languages I didn't know, including like English dialects, English. So I was in the habit of just, and I enjoyed it. I liked seeing Spanish words. I remember reading Junot Diaz for the first time, seeing stuff that, just cracked me up because I knew he was just using Spanish words and like twisting them to describe certain things in English and vice versa. So, yeah.
So my other question is, one of the characters that I really liked, but was just very brief, was the priest.
Oh, yeah.
Could you expand a little bit about how the priest sees?
So part of the research for this is that at some point I thought maybe Alfie would become a monk. So I went and got like the rules for the Benedictine order and I read them and I studied them a little bit to see what it would be like. And then I actually just went to the Abbey here for the first time. If has everybody been to the Abbey here? What's it called? The Abbey of the Genesee?
That's
Yeah.
down here.
And all the monks are like 75 years old. And I went in there and one of the 75-year-old monks came out into the shop. And I said something to him and he said, I hope I don't have a bad reputation around here. So he was like just jokey guy. And I was like, you're a monk, really? But that priest is sort of has that attitude, like trying not to take it so seriously. Like, yeah, it's religion and all, and we're men of the cloth, but you gotta cool out a little bit, man. So that was, yeah. That character is based on loosely on a writer I know in Canada. Yeah. Thank you, guys. I'm talking too much, and I do want to hear the open mic, and yeah. Okay.
Thank you, George.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone.